Greetings, adventurers, and welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. Okay, we do a lot of leather crafting on the show, and every time I do and I like dye a piece of leather, I always get in the comment section all of these different tips of ways I should dye it, different products I should be using, a whole bunch of different stuff. So I thought it was high time we do a deep dive into dyeing leather and see what different techniques work, how the different products go, and generally just kind of try out all the tips you guys have been telling me over the years. We have a lot to cover, so without much further ado, let's jump right in and level up this skill. So for starters, I wanted to try to take all these different products here, or different kinds of dye, and put them to the test. So for this little experiment, I'll be working with this Ecoflow Water Stain, this Ecoflow Water-Based leather dye, our regular Fibing's dye, Fibing's Pro dye, and Ecoflow oil dye. Now you will notice that I got all of these in a light brown because I figured it'd be fun to do a color match too as we go. Now just as a quick heads up, the main differences here, this water stain is kind of more surfacey. I've been told it doesn't really sink into the leather, but it sits more on the top. The water-based dye is, well, water-based. The carrier for the pigment is water. The regular Fibing's, I go back and forth between calling it Fibing's or Fibing's. Leave me down in the comment section which it is. But this dye here, it's the one I usually use. It has alcohol as a carrier, and the pigment itself is a powder. As opposed to the Pro dye, which is called an oil dye, but it still has an alcohol carrier, just the pigment itself is an oil. And the same thing goes with this Ecoflow oil dye here. I just thought it'd be fun to kind of compare and contrast the two similar products. Now to apply all of these, I'm going to just be using a standard dauber. Also, all the pieces of leather I'll be using were all cut from the same side of leather. So the differences that would normally be there if I used it from two separate animals shouldn't play a factor here. Okay, so starting with this water-based stain, I did like how it has this kind of squeezy top to it. I honestly wish more antiques had that because it's kind of a pain to get it out of the bottle. And with that squeeze in the cup, I can see exactly how thick it is. Again, it's almost like an antique gel. And it applies pretty much in the same way, not really soaking into the leather, but almost just kind of painting it on the top. Once I was happy with the coverage, I removed it with a rag, and it actually looks like it leaves a pretty even color. So the directions actually say that after you've applied it, allow to dry and then buff. Doesn't say anything about wiping it off afterwards. So I'm gonna try that too, just kind of applying it to the surface and then leaving it to dry. Let's see what happens, we'll see. Okay, so next up to bat is this Ecoflow water-based dye. Like you'd expect, this one seems the consistency of like colored water. And when put on the leather, it honestly behaves a lot like water, just kind of soaking into the piece instantly. And I liked how that behaved. By soaking in, not kind of sitting on the surface like that, I could see very clearly where my coverage was like built up too much or didn't have enough. Cool, now I'm gonna jump into the one that I actually have the most experience with. I learned on this Fibing's dye, the one that's just the alcohol carrier, not the oil dye. Texture-wise, this is a little bit thicker than the water base, and it goes on like that, just sitting on the surface for a moment while the alcohol carrier dries up. Now, since this is a powdered pigment, once that alcohol carrier dries up, you are left with some of that powder on the surface. So there's always an extra step with this stuff where you have to buff it away, or else you're gonna get some rub off on your leather that's gonna get on your clothes and stuff. Now this one, the Pro dye, is the one I'm most excited to use, and the one you all leave most in the comment section telling me that I should use. This again is the alcohol carrier with an oil-based pigment. Viscosity-wise, it's about the same as the regular Fibing's product, which makes sense since they both have an alcohol carrier. But on application, I found this soaked in almost more like the water dye. The leather immediately accepts the product, and the coloration seems super even. I also noticed right off the bat that that color is way lighter than the standard Fibing's. To the point it's kind of ridiculous. But that color with the Pro dye is really nice. I'm super interested to see how it stacks up against the Ecoflow version. Right off the bat, the Ecoflow has a lot thicker of a texture, almost more what I would expect from an oil. It goes on the same way too, sitting more like an oil on the surface before absorbing in. I'm hoping that because it's so thick yet still makes its way into the leather, that the color is going to be really rich. Yet when put side by side with the Pro dye, you can already see that it has a super dark appearance in comparison. Still, both look really even. Okay, so we're gonna let those dry and check them out, but while we do, I actually have two other things that you guys have said I should try out that I kind of wanted to test. The first of which is just using plain old food coloring. My first attempt of this consisted adding some red dye to a little bit of water. Now, I added a lot of this to that water just to try to make it as vibrant as possible. Still, once I put it on, it only kind of left like a really light pink hue. One that I don't think is going to dry much darker, to be honest. So to give this its best shot, I decided to add the straight dye right to the leather. This surprisingly imparted quite a bit of color, and it soaked into the leather really evenly. I am curious to see how this one is gonna turn out when dried. I'm interested to see if that color stays kind of that dark, because if so, honestly, it's kind of nice. All right, and this final one was given to me by Discord user Nader, sub Nader, who said that they've actually tried mixing baking soda with water. I am curious to see if this works. Their directions were to add enough baking soda so that the water turned a milky color. Then again, I just soaked it for about a minute before removing all of the excess moisture and surface powder. I am fascinated to see how that comes out. Okay, so now we have all these different products tried and dried. It's time to see what they look like. So first up is our water stain. And this actually came out really good. The color's nice, and though not particularly bright or warm, it is super even. I also have the other one where they said kind of let it dry before you buff it off. And this one did not come out even. It kind of has a swirly, marbly pattern to it, which, if that's what you're going for, if you're going for kind of a marble patterned leather, that's how you do that, because that looks pretty cool, honestly. Next on to our Ecoflow Water-Based dye, and this surprisingly dried the leather up more than I thought it was going to. See that little fold that's happening here? It's a little bit more crispy than I thought it would be, just being water. But again, it's really even, and I kind of like how rich the color came out. Though it doesn't look as perfect as the water stain, but I think because the water stain kind of almost paints onto the leather, it takes a lot of the character out of it. Whereas in the water dye, soaks in and kind of shows off the character a little more. I really like how that came out. Okay, I want to jump right over to the Fibing's oil dye, which honestly, I love. Disregarding this little spot from where I spilled some of that baking soda solution, that stuff super caustic, guys. Everything's really even, a nice, warm, rich color, especially when you compare it to the Ecoflow dye. Ecoflow is a lot more of a dull, muted brown. Still very even, and if that's the color you're going for, it looks good. But they're basically two different colors, both light brown. That said, the leather, super pliable. It almost feels like I don't have any product on it at all. Which is good because I'm more used to the regular Fibing's dye, which as you can see, just dried out the leather so much that it curled up on itself. It's super stiff, and not only that, but look at the color difference here. Though it's an even stain, why is it so dark? I would call that a medium to a dark brown. That is not a light brown. That is a light brown. Now my food color samples here were actually really interesting. As we saw, the one that was diluted with water is just this really light pink, but I'm not hating it. If you're going for a really light pink color, it's kind of nice. And the red came out a fairly solid color red. It's still a little bit on the pinkish side, but I mean, again, that's what you're going for and that's what you have access to. You can make that work. I bet if you added a bunch of different colors together, you could probably mix up something that you're pretty happy with. Though it would take a lot of dye, you'd want to make sure you mixed up a large batch because it took a good amount of dye just to get this coverage. You're probably better off just going to get actual leather dye. And finally, that baking soda mixture. Look at how dark this turned out. Look at how crazy the color changes from the natural leather color. That said, it made it just rock hard. Almost as if it's been burnt, which honestly, it might have kind of been burnt. That mixture is so alkaline, and leather is made up of a lot of fats and acids, which gets dissolved by that alkalinity. So you might be seeing kind of a chemical burn here. Still, it's so cool that I was kind of curious, what if I added less of the baking soda, or what if I changed the dwell time on it? So for science, I made a mixture that had a lot less baking soda in it and soaked that for about a minute to see how the color change would come out then. I also decided to try a sample piece where I didn't soak the leather, but rather just used a dauber to apply to the surface. And these actually worked out pretty well. Definitely leaving the leather a lot more flexible, but the surface was dry enough that when I did flex it, it left all of these little discolored flex marks that honestly look kind of cool. Now the one that I soaked is still a little bit crispy, but no more than when using the regular Fibing's dye. They feel almost the same, and this has a super consistent color. And the one that I just used the dauber on also had a pretty cool color change, making it look a lot more like aged leather, but not changing the leather at all. It still feels pliable. It feels just like raw leather. There's a cool little technique to stick in your cap in case you wanted to use it. Okay, I'd say that was a pretty comprehensive deep dive into the different kinds of leather dye options we have. So another thing you guys point out a lot in the comment section is that I should try pre-treating my leather, either wetting it first down with water or using some oil before adding my dye to it. So in the interest of testing out both methods, I took 3 pieces of leather and prepped them by applying some water to the surface. Then I added the water-based dye to one, the regular Fibing's dye to another, and the pro dye to the third. Basically just omitting the water stain because that sits on the surface, and the other oil dye because we're using the pro dye already. I also did the same thing this time preparing the leather with this 100% neat's foot oil, just making sure that it's soaked into all of their surfaces well. And then again applying the same dyes so that we compare and contrast and see if there's a difference. Okay, so starting with the water-based dye, we have it on the dry, untreated leather, then on the leather treated with water, and then finally the leather treated with oil. Difference really isn't that stark between them, though the piece treated with water does seem to be a little bit more even than the other two. Cool, so now we have the pro dye or the oil in this mix. Starting from the right with the dry leather, then the piece treated with oil, followed by the piece treated with water. On this one, I think the oil probably has the most consistent coloring, but all in all, they look pretty similar. It wasn't a huge difference. Now those two tests actually made a lot of sense because the water-based dye seemed a lot more even in the one that I treated with water ahead of time, whereas in the oil-based dye seemed a lot more even with the one I treated with oil. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. All in all though, the differences seemed really subtle. That is until we get to the regular Fibing's dye, which again is the one I'm most used to, and just it turns out it's the problem child. The color difference here was crazy, with the rightmost one not being treated with anything, the middle one being treated with water, and the leftmost being treated with oil. You can see how much darker the untreated leather is, especially when compared with the oil-treated leather, which has a much smoother chocolatey brown finish. That made a huge difference. Not only that, but adding the oil actually helped keep that leather really supple, where the other two were still really kind of crispy and dried out. All in all, I'd say the water-based dye and that pro dye, I could take or leave treating the leather ahead of time. It's just an extra step really, and it doesn't make a huge difference. But for the regular Fibing's alcohol-based dye, 100% I would use oil. You guys were right on that one for sure. Look at us, I feel like we're doing science, we're doing good. All right, so far we've gone over the different kinds of dye and how pre-treating the leather will change the outcome of that dye. The last piece of the puzzle here that I kind of want to put together is all the different ways you can actually apply that dye to the leather. Also, just so you know, the dye I'm using is the regular Fibing's alcohol-based dye, mostly because I have just a lot of it, and there's a lot of tests. Don't worry, we'll mill through them pretty quickly. The ways we're gonna try to do this are using a regular old dauber, a pad of wool, a couple of different varieties of sponge, some paper towel, a shop rag, a paintbrush, and a block dye, which is just a block of wood with a rag taped around it. I'm also gonna try dip dyeing in a couple of different spray bottles to see if we can kind of match what you would get from like an air gun. Okay, so for dyeing, the name of the game is to try to get as much on your first pass as possible to make sure it's nice and even. And the only one that had real trouble doing this was the paintbrush. This just didn't seem to hold enough dye and wanted to soak in as quickly as I could put it down. Where I would kind of want to use a paintbrush is more for small detail work, a little paintbrush to get into those little nooks and crannies. The rag here was my go-to for a long time. They're cheap and easy, and honestly, the end result comes out pretty good. Though you do lose a lot of stain in the material itself. It soaks in and then just kind of dries up. The same goes for the paper towel. In a pinch, it doesn't do a bad job, but in the end, you lose a lot more stain on the paper towel. Now for those sponges, I decided to make another little mini test to see what kind of sponge tends to work better. To go about this, I just drew a line down the middle and used a high density sponge on one side and a more premium stain applicator type sponge on the other side to see how the two compare. Wool is great. I've liked using wool for a while, but I always have trouble laying it down because it tends to dump a lot more stain than you think. It has almost the opposite problem that paper towels and rags have, where it doesn't hold on to the stain. It just puts it all down. When you're covering large amounts of space, awesome. If you're trying to be detailed, it's a little harder to control. Everyone knows the dauber. It is the trusty go-to for smaller projects. It does exactly what it says on the tin. Dip dyeing is super simple and a great way to get a very even coloring all around. Whenever I can get away with dip dyeing, it's usually my go-to just because it's so easy and it always looks really good. Now, I am really new to block dyeing. In fact, the first time I saw it, I was researching for this video and I saw Chuck Dorset's video for Weaver Leathercraft where he goes over this. But the method's an easy way to lay down a lot of dye pretty quickly. Now for other application methods, I decided to try out various kinds of sprayers. I've only had experience with airbrushes, but if you're not looking to make that investment, it'd be cool if we can come up with different ways to get the same kind of effect. First, we're going for this power unit sprayer that I got from Tandy's. It's just basically an aerosol can that you can screw onto a jar. I used the water-based dye on this just because I thought it'd be thin enough where I wouldn't have to thin it anymore to use it in a sprayer. And for my first pass, it seems like I'd be right. The dye sprayed on nice and evenly and it was looking great. But then my sprayer got all gummed up and stopped working. So it turns out, I was wrong. You have to thin it. You still have to thin the dye. To do that, I just use this dye reducer that I usually use when I'm painting with my airbrush. This made all the difference in the world. I was able to get a really even spray onto the leather and was super impressed with how well this thing worked. It was cheap and totally worth it if you're just looking to get a lot of coverage really evenly. Very impressed by this little thing. That said, there's only so much aerosol in these and you're gonna run out. Now my go-to for a long time has been, like I said, using an airbrush gun. These are just wonderful. Everything always comes out nice and even when you're painting with them. And you can do really cool things like add more dye in certain places to make kind of a vignette effect. Just the control you have with an airbrush is just, mwah, you're able to do so much with it. But if you're not looking to change aerosol cans all the time or invest in an airbrush for this, are there other options? So for my first test for that, I decided to go real low budget to see how it would look with a regular old spray bottle. This really didn't work at all. The droplets were just too big and the spray pattern was really messy. So as a last ditch effort, I stole this little mister from my wife. She uses it on plants. I was just curious. Basically, the way these ones work is rather than the little squeezy thing pulling product up, it actually pressurizes that cylinder and causes the product to come out in a fine mist. And this thing, look at how super even it is. It doesn't overuse the product and it comes out perfect. Seriously, this is my second choice now compared to the airbrush. Cool, so now that we've seen all these different ways you could apply the dye, do they make a difference at all? Honestly, for most of them, no, they kind of look the same to me. For example, the wool, rag, paper towel, and dauber look almost exactly the same. The main difference again just being you tend to lose a lot more product in the rag or the paper towel than you would on the dauber or the wool. The sponges came out mostly the same as well, with the higher density sponge laying down a bit more dye, and the other one looking a lot more like the rag or paper towel. Now the paintbrush, due to the nature to how it kind of gets put on, ends up being a little bit streaky. As I mentioned earlier, the block dye actually had a really cool effect. Because it's so rigid and flat, it ends up just hitting all of the really high areas, while leaving those low areas with a lot less dye in them. This shows off the texture and character of the leather and just gives the whole thing a bit more of an aged look. And finally, that dip dye is really consistent color all the way through, even on the edges. Though with the Fibing's dye, it did end up a lot more crispy than I'd like. Like, look at that. That's really crispy leather, but still really consistent. It looks good. Now for my airbrush, I actually did 2 examples just to show how really light I could go with that dye, or how I can add it a little bit darker wherever I wanted it. But that mister that I used was just the dark horse of this experiment. It came out of nowhere and did a phenomenal job. It's super consistent, and barring these little spots where I spilled some stuff on it, this leather came out really beautiful. So surprised at how good that works. Oh, I'm gonna use that all the time now. And finally, our little spray bottle. It didn't do a great job of making it even, but again, bright side. It's kind of like using mixed medium when you're painting, right? Like using a leaf to paint to have like a natural texture. If you were doing like a post-apocalyptic kind of thing, right? And you needed almost like oil stains or whatever, using a spray bottle and kind of messily getting it on there is exactly what you would want. That would work great. Again, there's no wrong way to do something if it achieves the effect you're looking for in the end. So there you have it. That was our deep dive into leather dyeing. I know it was a lot to consume, but I hope it gave you a lot of good information and tips to kind of how to go about coloring your leather. If you liked this kind of a deep dive, why don't you leave in the comments section and we'll see about doing it for other topics too. Now thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, why don't you give me some of that like it love, and don't forget to subscribe so you know when I release new content. In the meantime though, keep leveling up, you. You made it to the end screen. I really appreciate that. YouTube loves it when you do, and it's a great way to support this channel. Another great way to support this channel is by joining these people's noble ranks. Our Patreons keep this place running. And I want to give a special shout out to our newest high tier level Patreons, Dakota and Corvina. Thank you so much. We wouldn't be able to do what we do here without the generous giving of our patrons. If you're considering becoming a Patreon, link in the description below. Otherwise, you can click on one of these episodes here, and that supports us too. Go ahead. They're both good-ish. I made them. I like them.